My family had owned this lake for 60 years. Then a woman named Karen decided it belonged to her. She screamed, "I have rights," right at my own gate. I stayed calm. She didn't. Weeks of harassment had led to this exact moment. She thought the HOA board would always protect her. She had no idea what was sitting in my safe. By sunset, it was the sheriff who put handcuffs on her. My name is Michael Reyes, 42 years old, an engineer, husband to Sarah, father to 2 kids who still believe fireflies are magic. 3 years ago, we moved into Cedar Hollow, a lakeside community outside Asheville, into the same house my grandfather built in 1962, long before any homeowners association existed on this land. The lake behind our property wasn't a community amenity. It was ours, deeded to my grandfather by the county before Cedar Hollow was ever subdivided, before the HOA's covenants were written. We swam there, fished there, taught our kids to kayak there. It was quiet. That quiet didn't last. Cedar Hollow's HOA had always been a mild nuisance, mowing complaints, mailbox colors, the occasional fine for a trash can left out too long. Nobody took it too seriously. Then, 18 months ago, a new woman moved in 3 streets over. Karen Whitfield. She was HOA president. Karen introduced herself at the first meeting with a laminated binder and a smile that never touched her eyes. She talked about raising community standards and protecting shared value. Neighbors clapped politely. I clapped too. The smile was aimed, eventually, straight at my family's lake. The first sign of trouble was small. A mass email calling for a community amenities audit. It listed the pool, the clubhouse, the tennis courts, and, oddly, the lake area, described as a shared natural resource requiring formal management. I frowned at my screen. Nobody had ever called it shared before. I replied politely, attaching a scanned copy of my grandfather's original 1962 deed, which clearly excluded the lake and surrounding acreage from any later HOA formation. Karen's response came fast. "Thank you for your input. The board will review all historical claims as part of our audit process." Historical claims. Other neighbors started mentioning odd things. Survey stakes appeared near the lake's edge one weekend, though nobody could say who hired the surveyor. A community maintenance fee line item appeared on the HOA newsletter budget, labeled simply Lake Initiative TBD. I asked about it at a meeting. Karen said it was premature to discuss. My neighbor Denise, an older widow who'd lived in Cedar Hollow for 20 years, pulled me aside after that meeting. "Watch her," she whispered. She did this in her last neighborhood too. Took over the pool committee, then the pool itself. People said she made a lot of money doing it. I didn't take Denise too seriously at first. Cedar Hollow was small, friendly, the kind of place where drama meant someone's dog dug up a flower bed. I told Sarah about the survey stakes and the strange budget line, and she laughed it off. "She's probably just trying to justify her title," Sarah said, but Karen's newsletters kept mentioning the lake. Exploring recreational opportunities, assessing liability concerns, considering formal HOA stewardship. Each phrase sounded harmless alone. Together, they read like a slow legal argument being built in public. One email at a time, aimed at property that had never belonged to the association. I decided to be proactive. I requested a copy of the HOA's governing documents, the CC and RS, to see exactly what land they claimed jurisdiction over. It took 3 weeks and 2 follow-up emails before the management company finally sent them. Nowhere in 60 pages was the lake mentioned. Not once. I was wrong to. At the next meeting, Karen unveiled a lake access improvement plan, a rendering of a new dock, a swim platform, a fenced picnic area, all built on what she called the community lake. I raised my hand and calmly stated the lake wasn't HOA property. Karen smiled. As part of the project, she said. Clarify ownership. The phrase sat wrong with me for days. You don't clarify ownership of land you don't already believe you have a claim to. I started keeping every email, every newsletter, every meeting agenda in a folder labeled simply Lake. I didn't know yet how thick that folder would become. Denise wasn't the only one with stories. At the grocery store, a man named Frank told me Karen had pushed through a landscaping assessment in her old HOA that quietly transferred a shared greenbelt into association control, then leased it to a wedding venue company for private events. She's good at paperwork, Frank said. Real good. I mentioned all this to my lawyer friend, Tom, over beers. He shrugged. All the time. Usually it fizzles once someone shows a real deed. I told him I already had. He looked less certain. He said, or she doesn't care that you're right. The following week, a contractor's truck appeared at the lake's public-facing edge, near the community entrance, though not yet on my private frontage. 2 men with clipboards walked the shoreline, taking photos. When I asked what they were doing, one said, HOA sent us. Lake project assessment. I called Karen. That night I sat with Sarah at our kitchen table, the lake folder open between us, thick with printed emails. This isn't about a dock, I said. This is about taking something that isn't hers. Sarah looked at our sleeping kid's shoes by the door. Then we'd better be ready, she said quietly. The small conflict I'd been bracing for finally arrived on a Saturday morning in April. I walked down to our private dock to find a laminated sign zip-tied to the post. No trespassing. HOA lake access. Violators subject to fines. My daughter, Emma, stood beside me holding her little fishing pole. Confused, I tore the sign off, my hands not entirely steady, and drove straight to Karen's house. She answered before I even knocked, as if she'd been watching through the window, arms already crossed. That sign is HOA property, she said. I'll have to report you for tampering with association materials. This is my dock, I said, holding up a folder with the deed inside. My family's owned this lake since before Cedar Hollow existed. Karen barely glanced at the papers. The board has determined the lake falls under shared jurisdiction pending review, she said, as if reciting a line she'd rehearsed in a mirror. Determined how? I asked. There's no vote in the minutes. No amendment to the CC and RS. Karen's smile thinned. Legal processes take time, Michael. I'd hate for this to escalate into fines you didn't need. It wasn't a warning. It was, I would later understand, a threat dressed up as customer service. I left her porch shaking with anger I hadn't expected. Sarah met me at the car. What did she say? I told her. Sarah's jaw tightened. Spot with fines, she said. Over land she doesn't own. We drove home in silence. The torn signs still crumpled on my passenger seat. 3 days later, an official letter arrived from the HOA management company, a $250 fine for unauthorized removal of association signage, and a notice that our dock was under review for compliance with shared lake access standards. I read it twice, then called the management company directly, who admitted they'd simply processed what Karen submitted. She's the board president, the woman on the phone said apologetically. We act on the board's instructions. I asked who else was on the board. 2 names, both recent transplants who'd moved in around the same time as Karen. Neither had lived in Cedar Hollow more than a year. Something about that unsettled me. At the next general meeting, I stood and asked, publicly, for the board to show any legal basis for claiming the lake. Karen handed the floor smoothly to her board ally, a soft-spoken man named Gary, who said the matter was under legal review and would be addressed in due course. No documents. No answers. Afterward, an older neighbor named Walt caught my arm in the parking lot. I remember when your grandfather dug that lake bigger with a rented dozer back in the 70s, he said. Whole neighborhood used to fish there before there even was a neighborhood. She's got no idea what she's messing with. I thanked him, but worry outweighed comfort. I paid the $250 fine under protest. In writing, explicitly reserving my rights. On Tom's advice, don't give her an excuse to escalate over unpaid fines, he said. Pick your battle on the real issue, ownership. I hated writing that check. It felt like feeding a fire I was trying to put out. The kids stopped wanting to go down to the dock. Emma asked if the lake lady was going to take our fishing spot. I told her no, that Daddy wouldn't let that happen. And I meant it, but I also felt, for the first time, a flicker of real fear that I might be wrong. Karen posted in the neighborhood app that the Lake Initiative had strong community support, attaching a poll where 31 residents had voted, mostly for a new dock and picnic area, without any explanation that the land in question was privately deeded. People vote for playgrounds. They don't read fine print. I understood, suddenly, how this worked. I requested to see the poll's full wording. It never mentioned my address or existing ownership, just the lake area near the east entrance. Vague enough that residents assumed it was common ground, like the clubhouse lawn. It was, I realized, a quietly engineered mandate, built on omission rather than an outright lie. Sarah suggested we talk to a real estate attorney who specialized in HOA disputes, not just Tom's general advice. We found one 2 towns over, a woman named Priya Anand, who read our deed carefully and said, "This is about as clean a private ownership claim as I've seen. She has no legal leg to stand on." Then why does this feel so hard to stop? I asked. Priya sighed. Don't need to be legally right to be a nuisance. They just need to be persistent and count on you being tired before they are. That sentence stuck with me for the rest of the fight. Priya drafted a formal cease and desist letter, citing the recorded 1962 deed and demanding the HOA cease all claims and activity regarding the lake. We sent it certified mail. Karen's response, forwarded through the management company, was 3 lines long. Received. The board maintains its position pending further review. No retreat. No apology. That weekend, I noticed the same contractor's truck parked near the lake again, this time closer to my property line. A surveyor's orange flag stuck directly into my grandfather's grass. I confronted the man politely, asked who hired him. He hesitated, then admitted. A woman named Karen. Said it was HOA business. I photographed the flag, the truck, the license plate, and added it all to my growing folder. Sarah started calling it the war chest instead of the lake folder. I laughed the first time she said it. By the end of that month, I wasn't laughing about it anymore. The letter from Priya should have ended things. Instead, it seemed to sharpen Karen's focus. Within a week, a new newsletter went out titled Lake Area Compliance Update, stating that one resident has refused to cooperate with the board's review process, without naming me, though everyone on our street knew exactly who it meant. Neighbors I'd waved to for years started avoiding eye contact at the mailbox. One, a young father named Chris, finally admitted Karen had told people at a barbecue that I was hoarding a community resource and fighting the board out of pure selfishness. I felt something in my chest tighten that had nothing to do with fines. I requested official HOA board meeting minutes for the past year, as was my right as a resident. It took a month and a formal records request letter from Priya before they arrived, heavily redacted, with entire sections about Lake Initiative strategy blacked out under a vague claim of attorney-client privilege. Real HOAs don't usually hide this much. Denise told me she'd started hearing that Karen was quietly meeting with an events company from the next county over something about waterfront rental opportunities. I asked how she knew. My niece does their bookkeeping, she said. Saw an email about Cedar Hollow Lake, pending access agreement. That sentence sat in my stomach like a stone. I couldn't prove the events company connection yet, but it explained a pattern I hadn't wanted to see. Karen wasn't building a community amenity out of civic pride. She was clearing a path toward something that could generate revenue, and my family's stubborn, deeded ownership was the one obstacle standing directly in her way. The HOA sent a second fine, this time $500, for failure to comply with shoreline access standards, even though no such standards existed in any document I'd been given. I paid again under written protest, my hand shaking with anger rather than fear now. Priya said the paper trail of unjust fines would matter later. I hoped she was right. My son, Danny, came home from a friend's house upset, saying another kid had told him his dad was stealing the lake from everyone. He was 7. He didn't understand deeds or covenants. He just understood that other kids thought his family was the villain in a story we hadn't chosen to be part of. I sat Danny down and explained, as simply as I could, that our great-grandfather had bought the lake fair and square long before the neighborhood existed, and that the HOA president was mistaken. Danny nodded slowly. So she's lying? He asked. I hesitated. And doesn't like it, I said. Sarah started documenting our own side publicly, careful and factual, posting the actual 1962 deed excerpt in the neighborhood app whenever Karen's Lake Initiative language resurfaced. Some neighbors thanked her privately. Nobody defended us publicly. Karen had built, in less than a year, a quiet culture where crossing her felt riskier than staying silent. At the HOA's spring meeting, Karen announced a special assessment of $150 per household to fund lake area legal and development costs, framing it as an investment in shared property values. Neighbors grumbled about the cost but mostly accepted it. Nobody connected that assessment to the exact legal fight the HOA was waging against my family. I stood again, this time with Priya's letter in hand, and read aloud, calmly, the relevant deed language proving the lake was private property. A few neighbors looked genuinely surprised. Karen interrupted twice, calling it a matter for executive session. Before the board chair, clearly rehearsed, moved swiftly to the next agenda item. Afterward, 3 separate neighbors approached me quietly, apologizing for not speaking up, admitting they hadn't realized the lake initiative involved private land at all. One, an older man named Roy, said, "She made it sound like you were the one trying to steal something." Sorry, son. Small comfort, but it mattered. That night, someone cut the shared irrigation line that ran along the property boundary, the one feeding both my garden and the HOA's small entrance flower bed. HOA maintenance blamed old pipe deterioration. I couldn't prove sabotage, but the timing, days after the meeting, felt too precise to be coincidence. Priya suggested we escalate to a formal quiet title action, a lawsuit asking a judge to officially confirm our ownership beyond any HOA dispute. It would cost money and time, but it would end the ambiguity Karen kept exploiting. Sarah and I talked late into the night before agreeing. Enough was enough. Filing the lawsuit felt like both relief and dread. Relief, because finally something concrete moved forward. Dread, because I knew Karen wouldn't simply retreat once served. People who build their identity around control rarely step back gracefully. They usually escalate, especially when they're afraid of losing face in front of an audience they built. Karen was served at her home on a Tuesday afternoon. Within hours, the neighborhood app exploded with a new post from her, disappointed that a neighbor has chosen litigation over community dialogue. No mention that dialogue had meant fines, signage, redacted minutes, and surveyors on my grass without permission for nearly 2 months. Some neighbors sided with her instantly, commenting about divisive lawsuits and not the Cedar Hollow way. Others, quietly, messaged me privately with support they weren't brave enough to post. I began to understand that Karen's real power wasn't legal at all. It was social, the fear of being her next public target. The HOA's insurance-appointed attorney, a tired-sounding man named Mr. Dell, called to discuss resolution options. When I mentioned the 1962 deed, he went quiet for a moment. "That predates the association entirely," he said carefully. "I'll need to review this with the board." I sensed, for the first time, a crack in Karen's fortress. That crack didn't stop Karen from pushing forward. A week later, a Lake Area Community Day was announced, complete with a rented inflatable waterslide positioned, according to the flyer's little map, directly on my private shoreline. No permission requested. No acknowledgement of the pending lawsuit. Just a flyer, and a date, and my name nowhere on it. I called Priya immediately. She drafted an emergency letter demanding the event be moved or canceled, citing active litigation and trespass concerns. The HOA's attorney responded that the board would take it under advisement, which I now understood was corporate speak for doing whatever they wanted until someone physically stopped them. Sarah and I debated whether to simply block the access point ourselves that weekend. Priya advised against direct confrontation. "Document everything," she said. If she trespasses in front of witnesses while litigation is active, that helps us more than a shouting match on a Saturday morning. The morning of Lake Area Community Day, I stood on my own porch with a camera, watching a rented truck unload an inflatable slide at the edge of my shoreline, while 30 or so neighbors gathered nearby with lawn chairs and coolers, entirely unaware they were standing on the edge of an active property dispute. Karen arrived in a sundress and sunglasses, clipboard in hand, directing the setup crew like a wedding planner. When she spotted me filming from my porch, she waved cheerfully, as if we were simply two neighbors enjoying the same lovely afternoon. It was, I realized, a performance staged entirely for an audience she controlled. I walked down calmly, camera still recording, and told her, loud enough for nearby neighbors to hear, that this was private property under active litigation, and that setting up equipment here constituted trespass. Karen's smile flickered. The board has determined shared access rights, she said again. The same rehearsed line, thinner now. There is no board determination, I said. There's a lawsuit, and you're on the wrong side of the deed. A few neighbors exchanged uncomfortable glances. One mother quietly pulled her kids back from the slide. Karen's voice rose slightly. You're welcome to take this up with the board, she said. Not with me personally. I called the county sheriff's non-emergency line that afternoon, calmly explaining the situation and the active lawsuit. A deputy arrived within 40 minutes, reviewed my deed copy, and informed Karen and the setup crew that continued use of the shoreline could constitute criminal trespass given the documented ownership dispute. The slide came down within the hour. Karen didn't speak to me as the deputy explained the situation, though I caught her watching from a distance, arms crossed, jaw tight. For the first time since this began, I saw not confidence on her face, but something closer to disbelief, as if she genuinely hadn't expected the law to simply agree with paper. That evening, the neighborhood app lit up with conflicting accounts. Karen posted that an overzealous resident called the police on a children's event, carefully omitting the deputy's actual findings. I posted the deputy's card number and invited anyone with questions to call and verify directly. Only a handful of people did. It was enough. Denise called me that night, laughing quietly. You should have seen her face when that deputy pulled out his notebook, she said. First time in 18 months I've seen Karen Whitfield not have a rehearsed answer ready. I didn't feel triumphant yet, only tired, but it was the first genuinely good night's sleep in weeks. The following week, the HOA's insurance attorney requested a settlement conference, suggesting the board might be open to formally acknowledging our private ownership in exchange for dropping certain fine disputes. Priya was skeptical. They're testing whether you'll take a quiet win instead of a public one, she said. Karen's protecting her image, not the truth. We attended the conference anyway, cautiously. Karen sat stiffly beside Mr. Dell, saying little, letting him do the talking. He offered to waive our fines and issue a private letter confirming our boundary, provided we signed a non-disparagement clause about the HOA. Priya nearly laughed out loud. Absolutely not, she said. The truth isn't negotiable. We rejected the offer. For just a moment before she composed it again, looked less like disappointment and more like fear, the specific fear, I would later understand, of someone who needed this settled quietly, for reasons that had nothing to do with community harmony at all. Priya's paralegal, digging through public county records as part of discovery, found something odd: a rental listing on a boutique events website for Private Mountain Lake, Cedar Hollow Estates, advertising weddings and corporate retreats, photographed from an angle that unmistakably showed my grandfather's dock and the willow tree beside it. The listing's contact email wasn't the HOA's official address. It traced back to a small LLC called Hollow Waters Events, registered only 4 months earlier. The registered agent's name made my stomach drop: Gary Whitfield, Karen's husband, on the HOA board, deferring every question about the lake initiative to his wife. I showed Priya the listing that night over a video call. She went quiet for a long moment, scrolling through photos of my dock, my kids' fishing chairs still visible in one blurry background shot. "This isn't a community project," she finally said. "This was always a business plan. You were never fighting an HOA. You were fighting a landlord who hadn't finished stealing the land yet." Everything reordered itself in my mind at once. The survey stakes, the vague poll, the redacted minutes, the special assessment quietly funding legal and development costs. None of it had been about shared community value. It had been infrastructure for a private income stream, built on land that was never Karen's to rent out. We couldn't prove Gary's involvement was authorized by the full board, but the timeline was damning. Hollow Waters Events registered 2 weeks after the first Lake Initiative newsletter went out. Karen had begun laying legal groundwork for ownership before she'd even finished pretending the idea was still just a community suggestion. Priya added the listing and the LLC registration to our discovery request, demanding the HOA disclose any board member's financial interest in lake-related development. The attorney's response took over a week this time, notably slower than before. Each delay another small confirmation that we'd finally found the thread that could unravel everything. I didn't tell Sarah right away. I needed a night to sit with it myself first. The sheer audacity of it, the quiet cruelty of watching my kids' fishing chairs used as marketing props for a business scheme, built on threats and fines aimed at making my own family too exhausted to notice. When I finally showed her the listing, Sarah's hands trembled slightly scrolling through the photos. She used our dock, Emma's little chair. Her voice cracked, not from sadness, but from a controlled, focused kind of anger I'd rarely seen in her. "She's not just wrong," she said.
"She's been lying this whole time."
We printed everything, added it to the war chest, now 3 inches thick. Priya warned us not to confront Karen directly yet. "Let discovery force it into daylight properly," she said. "If she panics before we're ready, she'll destroy evidence instead of handing it to us in a deposition." Patience had never felt harder to practice. That weekend, for the first time in months, we let Emma and Danny fish off the dock again, quietly, without announcing it to anyone. Watching them laugh at a wriggling bluegill, I felt something steady return to my chest. Whatever came next, I thought, we would face it having already remembered what we were fighting for. For a few weeks, things went strangely quiet. No new fines. The lake. Karen even waved politely from her car one morning, as if the lawsuit, the slide, the trespassing surveyor, none of it had happened. Sarah called it the calm before something worse. I hoped, foolishly, that she was wrong. I reached out, cautiously, suggesting Karen and I meet privately to review my grandfather's original 1962 deed together, hoping a direct look at the county stamp document might finally end the dispute without further legal cost to either side. To my surprise, she agreed, suggesting coffee at the clubhouse the following Thursday. She arrived on time, notably without her clipboard, dressed casually instead of in HOA president mode. She looked, for the first time, almost human, tired, maybe, though I reminded myself tired people could still be dangerous ones. I laid the deed copy on the table between us. She actually read it, slowly, this time. "This looks legitimate," she admitted quietly, tracing the county seal with one finger. For a moment, I let myself believe this might finally end reasonably. "I think there's been some real confusion," she continued. "I'll bring this to the board." Sounded almost like an apology. I wanted badly to believe it was one. That weekend, Cedar Hollow held its annual community barbecue at the clubhouse lawn. Karen attended without her usual entourage of board allies, chatting easily with neighbors, even complimenting Sarah's potato salad. Denise caught my eye across the pavilion and mouthed, skeptically, "Don't trust it." I nodded. Some part of me already agreed with her. Danny and Emma played cornhole with Chris's kids. All previous tension between families apparently forgotten in the easy chaos of a summer evening. For a few hours, Cedar Hollow felt like the place we'd moved into 3 years earlier. Simple, friendly, unremarkable in the best possible way. I let myself enjoy it, cautiously. Priya called Monday morning with less comforting news. The HOA's attorney had quietly requested a 30-day extension on our discovery deadline, citing ongoing internal review. Priya's tone was flat. "That's not de-escalation," she said.
"That's someone buying time to clean."
I mentioned the pleasant coffee meeting, the barbecue, Karen's apparent softening. Priya was unmoved. "People like this don't stop because they realize they're wrong," she said. "They stop, temporarily, when they realize they're caught, and start again the moment they think they've found a way around it." I didn't want to believe her. A few days later, Denise mentioned overhearing Gary Whitfield at the hardware store, ordering fresh survey stakes, same spot as before. When I asked Karen about it directly through email, her reply was breezy. "Just routine measurements for our own records. Nothing to worry about." The exclamation point felt, suddenly, deeply insincere. I drove past the lake's edge that evening and found new orange flags, closer to my dock than before, one practically touching the post itself. Whatever softness Karen had shown over coffee evaporated in the face of that small, deliberate intrusion. The calm, exactly as Sarah predicted, had only ever been a pause to regroup. Priya's paralegal uncovered something else during the quiet weeks. A new listing on the same event's website. This one for a fall Harvest Lake wedding package, complete with a booking calendar showing 3 tentative reservations already, all scheduled for dates well after our lawsuit's current trial timeline. They weren't slowing down. They were preparing to launch. I confronted Karen by email, attaching a screenshot of the listing, asking directly whether the HOA board had authorized any commercial use of the disputed property. Her response came the next morning, curt and formal. "Please direct all further communication through counsel." The friendly coffee shop version of Karen was gone, replaced instantly by the old one. Sarah and I sat down with Emma and Danny that weekend, gently explaining that the lake lady situation wasn't over yet, that we might need to be a little more careful again for a while. Emma asked, very seriously, "Is she going to win?" I told her the truth. I didn't know yet, but we wouldn't stop trying. Priya filed a motion demanding immediate disclosure of any commercial agreements related to the lake, citing the wedding listing as evidence of active harm during litigation. The judge assigned to our case, a no-nonsense woman named Judge Alvarez, granted an expedited hearing date. Karen's side, for the first time, didn't request another extension. I understood, watching that court notice arrive, that the brief calm hadn't been peace at all. It had been Karen testing whether charm alone might make me quietly abandon a lawsuit that threatened both her reputation and her husband's growing business. It hadn't worked. Less polite. The expedited hearing brought Karen's real legal team into view for the first time. Not just the tired HOA insurance attorney, but a sharper private lawyer named Mr. Voss, clearly hired personally, whose retainer, Priya later confirmed through public filings, traced back to a shell account connected to Hollow Waters events. Mr. with practiced confidence that the Harvest Lake wedding package listing was a hypothetical marketing concept not yet tied to any confirmed transaction on disputed land, and that the HOA board bore no responsibility for a private business venture unrelated to official association activity. Judge Alvarez looked distinctly unconvinced. Still, without a signed contract in hand yet, the judge declined to issue an immediate injunction, instead ordering both parties into mandatory mediation within 30 days while discovery continued. It wasn't the clean win we'd hoped for, but it bought time, and it put Karen's business scheme officially on the court's radar. Karen's public tone shifted hard after that hearing. The neighborhood app filled with posts about costly litigation draining HOA resources and one family's refusal to compromise, conveniently omitting any mention of the wedding venue listing or her husband's LLC. Several neighbors, reading only her version, began openly criticizing me at the mailbox. Chris, whose son had played cornhole with Danny just weeks earlier, stopped waving entirely. His wife told Sarah at pickup that they'd heard we were suing to keep a public resource all to ourselves, a phrase lifted almost word for word from Karen's newsletter. The lie had traveled faster and further than any of our facts. A new special assessment appeared on the HOA ledger, $300 per household for unexpected legal defense costs related to ongoing litigation.
I watched, furious, as neighbors who'd never even seen the disputed deed were now paying, unknowingly, to fund the very lawsuit defending Karen's husband's private business interests on my family's land.
I posted the wedding listing screenshot publicly in the neighborhood app, along with Gary's LLC registration, laying the whole timeline out as plainly as I could without violating any court confidentiality rules Priya had warned me about. The post got dozens of comments within an hour, tone shifting rapidly from skepticism to alarm. Karen's response was swift and furious. Though carefully worded, she accused me of spreading misinformation to manipulate community sentiment during active litigation, and threatened to report the post to the app's moderators for removal. Came down within an hour. But screenshots, as always, had already spread further than the original post ever could. That night, someone slashed both tires on my truck in our own driveway, The security camera conveniently angled just wrong enough by a routine positioning update the HOA landscaping crew had performed the week before to miss the culprit's face entirely. I couldn't prove it was Karen. I no longer believed it wasn't. Sarah wanted to call the police immediately, and we did, filing an official report. Though without clear footage, there was little the responding officer could do beyond documenting it. Priya added the incident to our growing timeline regardless. Pattern matters in court, she said.
Even things we can't.
The mediation session, when it finally arrived, was tense from the first handshake. Karen sat rigid beside Mr. Voss, refusing to make eye contact. The mediator, a retired judge named Mr. Whitlock, reviewed both sides' documents carefully, then asked Karen directly whether the HOA disputed the authenticity of my 1962 deed. We dispute its continued relevance given subsequent community development patterns, Mr. Voss answered smoothly, before Karen could speak at all. Mr. rose slightly. A deed doesn't lose relevance because a neighborhood grew up around it, he said. It's not a decorating trend. It's a legal boundary. Mr. Voss had no immediate reply. Mediation ended without settlement. Both sides too entrenched to bend, though Mr. Whitlock's report to the court noted, pointedly, that the HOA's position appeared legally unsupported based on documentation reviewed. It wasn't a ruling, but it was, finally, an outside professional voice confirming what I'd been saying since that first torn sign. Karen didn't take the report well. The following week brought a new HOA notice, a formal complaint against our family for creating a hostile community environment, citing my public posts about the wedding listing as evidence. Felt absurd. Being accused of hostility by a woman whose husband had slashed our tires. Allegedly, in the dark. Priya wasn't worried about the complaint itself, which had no real legal teeth outside HOA bylaws already proven not to cover our property. But she was worried about the pattern. She's not thinking strategically anymore, Priya said. She's thinking about survival. That makes her less predictable and possibly more dangerous. That fear became concrete 2 days later, when Emma came home from the bus stop saying a woman had waved at her funny near the lake trail, standing where she normally wasn't allowed, watching the kids walk home. Emma couldn't describe her clearly, just that she wore sunglasses and the lake lady's kind of shoes. I called the sheriff's department again, this time with real fear coloring my voice instead of measured calm. A deputy took the report seriously, noting the ongoing property dispute as context, and increased patrol frequency near the bus stop for the following 2 weeks. Sarah started driving the kids herself regardless, unwilling to take chances. Denise, hearing about the incident, showed up at our door with a casserole and a grim expression. I told you what she did in her last neighborhood, she said. There was a family there too. Resisted her pool takeover. Their car got keyed. Days. Nobody could ever prove it was her. I asked Denise if she'd be willing to say that on record, formally, as part of our case. She hesitated, clearly weighing fear against conscience, before finally nodding slowly. If it helps stop her before she does worse, she said, then yes. I'm tired of watching her do this to good people. Priya took Denise's statement carefully, framing it not as proof of the tire slashing or the bus stop incident directly, but as evidence of a documented pattern of behavior potentially relevant to the court's understanding of Karen's credibility and character. Every piece, she reminded me, mattered less alone than woven together. Karen's public posture grew increasingly erratic. A newsletter went out accusing certain litigious residents of endangering community harmony for personal financial gain. An accusation so inverted from reality that Sarah actually laughed out loud reading it, a bitter, exhausted laugh rather than an amused one. "She's projecting," Sarah said.
Every accusation.
At the next general HOA meeting, tensions boiled over publicly for the first time. When I stood to speak about the wedding venue listing, Karen interrupted repeatedly, eventually banging her gavel and declaring, "This meeting is adjourned," nearly 40 minutes early, leaving a room full of confused, murmuring neighbors behind her. Gary Whitfield, silent throughout most of the fight until now, cornered me in the parking lot afterward. "You have no idea what you're costing my family," he hissed, close enough that I could smell coffee on his breath. "That land is basically worthless to you. It's everything to us." I stayed quiet, cataloging every word. I repeated Gary's exact statement to Priya the next morning. Her eyes lit up in a way I hadn't seen since the wedding listing discovery. "That's practically an admission," she said. "He just told you," essentially unprompted, "that this was always about the money, not community stewardship. Write down everything you remember, right now, while it's fresh." The following week, discovery finally forced open the HOA's internal financial records, and Priya's paralegal found it. A signed, though not yet fully executed, lease agreement between Hollow Waters Events and Cedar Hollow Lake Area, dated 3 weeks before that first innocent-sounding amenities audit email had ever landed in my inbox. The timeline was now undeniable. Karen hadn't discovered a genuine community need for lake improvements and later, coincidentally, developed a business idea. She had built the entire lake initiative narrative backward from an already signed lease, manufacturing community consent for a decision her family had made, privately, months before anyone else knew. Priya moved quickly to add the lease agreement as central evidence, filing an amended complaint that now included fraud and civil conspiracy allegations against both Karen and Gary Whitfield personally, separate from the HOA itself. Judge Alvarez scheduled a new hearing, faster this time, clearly losing patience with the case's slow unraveling. Karen's neighborhood posts stopped entirely after the amended complaint was filed. No newsletters. Just silence, broken only by occasional sightings of her car leaving early and returning late. And once, memorably, an argument audible from the street outside her own house, Gary's raised voice cutting through the evening quiet. Denise reported that the for sale sign appeared briefly in a neighbor's yard down the street from Karen, then vanished within a day. Rumor spreading that it had been a Whitfield family friend testing the market, perhaps preparing an exit strategy before things got worse. It never got confirmed. Didn't need to be, to change the mood. I found myself, oddly, not gloating but exhausted, sitting on the dock one evening watching Emma cast her line into water that had somehow become the center of 6 months of my life. "Are we winning?" she asked, not looking up from her bobber. "I think so," I said.
It's just taking long.
Sarah's mother, visiting for the weekend, listened to the entire saga over dinner, shaking her head slowly. "People like that don't stop because they're wrong," she said, echoing Priya almost exactly. "They stop because stopping becomes less painful than continuing. You have to make continuing the expensive choice, not the easy one." That advice crystallized something in Priya's strategy too. Rather than simply proving ownership, which we'd essentially already done, she began building toward maximum exposure. Fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, unauthorized commercial use of disputed property, civil conspiracy, a case designed not just to win, but to make quiet settlement impossible to survive politically. Karen requested a private settlement meeting again, this time without Mr. Foss present, just her and Sarah and me at a coffee shop 2 towns over, away from Cedar Hollow's watching eyes. She looked smaller somehow, the polished HOA president posture gone. "What do you actually want?" she asked, voice tight with something close to desperation. "The truth. On record," I said. "A public acknowledgement the lake was never HOA property. Cancellation of every fine. And full disclosure of the wedding venue lease to the entire HOA membership. Not just the board." Karen's face went pale. "That would end me here," she said quietly. "I know," I answered. She left without agreeing to anything. But something in her posture as she walked to her car looked different than it had at any point in the entire fight. Not defiant. Not performing for an audience. Just tired. Cornered. Finally understanding that paperwork and public relations couldn't outrun a properly documented deed forever. 2 days later, an anonymous tip arrived in Priya's inbox from an address that traced back, eventually, to someone inside the HOA management company itself, internal emails showing. Karen had personally instructed staff to delay my records requests as long as legally possible, and to redact anything referencing prior deed conflicts from meeting minutes. The obstruction evidence transformed the case again. This wasn't simply a mistaken land grab anymore, or even just an undisclosed business venture. It was documented, intentional concealment of information from both me and the wider HOA membership, evidence that could support not just civil penalties but potential referral for criminal fraud investigation. Priya requested an emergency status conference with Judge Alvarez, presenting the obstruction emails alongside the wedding lease and Gary's parking lot admission. The judge's expression, usually carefully neutral, hardened visibly reading through the packet. "I'm ordering a full evidentiary hearing," she said. "This has moved well beyond a simple boundary dispute." Word of the emergency hearing somehow reached Cedar Hollow's neighborhood app within a day. Likely leaked by someone on the management company staff uncomfortable with what they'd been asked to do. Neighbors who'd once repeated Karen's hostile litigious family narrative now flooded the thread with confused, increasingly alarmed questions. Chris texted me for the first time in months. A short message. "Heard some of what's actually going on. Sorry for how we treated you guys. Didn't have the full picture." I stared at the message for a long time before replying simply, "Appreciate you saying that. It wasn't everything. It was something." Karen's allies on the board began distancing themselves publicly. Gary, the soft-spoken board member, releasing a statement claiming he'd always had concerns about the lake initiative's legal basis but had been discouraged from raising them. A convenient rewriting of history that nonetheless signaled her support inside the HOA was collapsing rapidly. The management company itself sent a notice to all Cedar Hollow residents distancing the company from certain board decisions currently under legal review.
Effectively confirming, without quite saying it outright, that Karen's leadership had operated well outside normal, sanctioned processes for most of the past year.
At home, the mood shifted too. Emma started fishing off the dock again without asking permission first. An unconscious return to normalcy that meant more to me than any legal filing. Danny asked if the lake lady was in trouble now. I told him yes. Probably. And that trouble had been a long time coming. Priya warned me the coming evidentiary hearing would likely be the real turning point, but also the most volatile moment yet. Cornered people don't always fold quietly, she said. Sometimes they lash out one last time before the walls close in completely. Stay careful. We're close, but not finished. That warning proved prophetic within days. A county inspector arrived unannounced, citing an anonymous complaint about unpermitted dock construction, despite the dock having stood unchanged since my grandfather built it decades before any permitting requirements existed. The inspector, to his credit, quickly recognized the complaint as baseless once shown our records. Priya suspected, though couldn't yet prove, that Karen had filed the complaint herself, a last flailing attempt to generate any official document suggesting wrongdoing on our side before the evidentiary hearing arrived. She's trying to muddy the water, Priya said. Pun regrettably intended. Don't let it rattle you. Not strength. The following weekend, our home security camera, freshly reinstalled with a wider angle after the tire slashing, caught grainy footage of a figure walking the shoreline near our dock well after midnight, pausing directly at the property line before turning back. The gait, the build, looked unmistakably familiar, though the footage was too dark for certainty. We sent the footage to both Priya and the sheriff's department. A deputy reviewed it and, while unable to make a definitive identification, noted it corroborated the pattern of trespass and harassment already documented in our earlier reports. Another piece, not conclusive alone, but stacking steadily atop everything that came before it. Karen's neighbors, watching this unfold in real time through the app and word of mouth, began requesting a special HOA meeting to formally address leadership concerns. A petition that gathered enough signatures within 48 hours to force an emergency session, independent entirely of our lawsuit's own separate timeline. At that emergency session, held in a packed clubhouse with residents standing along the walls, Karen attempted to control the narrative one final time, opening with a prepared statement about misunderstandings and personal attacks against her family. The room's mood, palpably, had already shifted well beyond anything a prepared statement could repair. Denise stood, unprompted, and read aloud, calmly and clearly, everything she'd witnessed over the past year, the survey stakes, the pattern from Karen's previous neighborhood, the tire slashing timeline, the wedding listing screenshots many residents had already seen. The room went utterly silent, the kind of silence that follows a truth nobody can unhear. Gary attempted to interject, defending his wife, but was shouted down by residents furious about the special assessments that had, they now understood, quietly funded legal defense for a private family business venture built on stolen shoreline. Someone in the back yelled, "We paid for her wedding venue." The room erupted. The emergency session ended without a formal vote. procedural rules requiring proper notice for any removal action, but the outcome felt inevitable regardless. Karen left the clubhouse alone, Gary trailing several steps behind, neither speaking, cameras from at least 3 residents' phones capturing the walk of shame neither of them could control any longer. I didn't attend that emergency session myself, choosing instead to stay home with Sarah and the kids, wanting our family's evening untangled, just once, from the fight that had consumed us for so long. Denise called afterward, breathless. "It's over for her here," she said. "Whatever happens in court now, Cedar Hollow is done with Karen Whitfield." Denise's optimism proved premature. Cornered people, as Priya had warned, don't always fold quietly, and Karen's next move revealed a desperation that crossed a line none of us had fully anticipated. Even after everything that had already happened over the preceding months of fines, surveillance, and quiet sabotage, 3 nights after the emergency meeting, Sarah woke me at 2 a.m., certain she'd heard someone at the back door. I grabbed a flashlight and found the door handle scratched, as if someone had tried, unsuccessfully, to force it open. Our security camera, again, caught only a shadowy figure fleeing toward the tree line near the lake. We called the sheriff's department immediately. A deputy arrived within 20 minutes, documenting the scratched handle and reviewing the footage, which showed enough of the figure's build and unusual, deliberate walk to match both the earlier midnight shoreline footage and, disturbingly, general descriptions matching Gary Whitfield's build far more than Karen's. Priya escalated immediately, filing an emergency motion for a temporary restraining order against both Karen and Gary Whitfield, citing the accumulated pattern tire slashing, bus stop surveillance, midnight shoreline trespassing, and now an apparent attempted break-in. Judge Alvarez granted an expedited hearing within 48 hours, her patience for delay now fully exhausted. At the restraining order hearing, Mr. Foss argued there was insufficient direct evidence tying either Whitfield definitively to any single incident. Judge Alvarez, reviewing the timeline laid out chronologically, disagreed sharply. Pattern evidence exists precisely for situations like this, she said. I'm granting a temporary order. Both parties are to maintain 200 yards distance from the Reyes family and property. Karen's face, in the courtroom, cracked for the first time into something raw and unguarded. Not the polished HOA president mask. Not even simple anger, but real, visible fear, as if the restraining order made concrete. Finally, just how far outside acceptable behavior her family had drifted over the past year. That fear didn't translate into retreat. 2 days after the restraining order took effect, an anonymous tip landed with our county's code enforcement office claiming our property had illegal structures encroaching on protected wetland, triggering an unwelcome, unscheduled inspection that, while ultimately clearing us entirely, cost us 3 stressful days and another round of legal fees. Priya traced the tip's originating email, through a subpoena to the county office, back to an IP address registered to a coffee shop 2 towns over. The very same coffee shop, notably, where Karen had once met us to plead for a quiet settlement. It wasn't definitive proof, but it painted an unmistakable picture. Sarah, increasingly frightened for the kids' safety despite the restraining order, suggested we consider temporarily relocating the children to her mother's house until the case resolved. I resisted at first, unwilling to let Karen's escalating desperation uproot our family further. But after the wetland complaint, I finally agreed it was the responsible choice. Emma cried when we explained the plan, not understanding why the lake lady got to make her leave her own room, her own school, her own dock. I promised her it was temporary, that we were close to the end. Though privately I wasn't entirely certain anymore just how much further Karen was willing to go. With the kids safely at their grandmother's, Sarah and I installed an even more extensive security system. Motion-activated floodlights along the entire shoreline. Cameras covering every approach to the house. Priya, reviewing our footage regularly now as part of ongoing evidence gathering, called it the most thoroughly documented HOA dispute she'd ever handled. A week into the restraining order, Gary Whitfield was spotted, according to Denise, loading boxes into a moving truck parked outside their house late at night, an unusual hour for any legitimate move. Denise, ever the vigilant neighbor, photographed the license plate and the boxes, several labeled, oddly, Lake Confidential Records. Priya immediately filed an emergency motion to prevent destruction or removal of evidence, citing Denise's photographs and timestamp. Judge Alvarez, already deeply skeptical of the Whitfield's conduct, granted an order requiring preservation of all records related to Hollow Waters events and the Cedar Hollow Lake dispute, with Sheriff's Department oversight of compliance. A deputy arrived at the Whitfield residence the following morning to verify compliance, discovering Gary in the process of loading a second batch of boxes, several containing paper files clearly related to HOA financials and the wedding venue lease agreements. He was cited for violating the preservation order, a small but significant legal misstep. That citation, combined with the restraining order and the mounting evidentiary hearing evidence, finally cracked something loose inside the HOA's own defense strategy. Mr. requested a private meeting with Priya, no longer speaking with Karen and Gary's confidence from earlier months, his tone now noticeably more cautious, more procedural. My clients may be open to a more comprehensive resolution, Mr. Foss said carefully during that call, which Priya put on speaker so I could listen in real time. Comprehensive meaning what? Exactly? Priya asked. Meaning, he said slowly, they understand the exposure here extends well beyond what they initially anticipated. Priya refused any resolution short of full public disclosure. Criminal referral cooperation regarding the obstruction evidence, and complete transfer of any remaining disputed claim on our property. On the record, in open court. This isn't a negotiation anymore, she told Mr. Foss. Control on your end. Act accordingly. Karen, apparently, wasn't ready to accept terms that severe, even as her own attorney urged caution. Denise reported, through the neighborhood grapevine that never seemed to fully go quiet even amid restraining orders, that Karen had been overheard telling a friend she still had one card left to play before this was truly over. That card, turned out, was an attempt to have the entire lawsuit reframed publicly as a personal vendetta rather than a legitimate property dispute. Karen gave an interview to a small local news blog, painting herself as a dedicated volunteer HOA president, being harassed by a wealthy family unwilling to share community resources. The article, thin on verified facts and heavy on Karen's uncontested quotes, briefly gained traction online before Priya sent the outlet a formal request for correction, attaching the county-recorded deed, the wedding venue listing, and the preservation order violation. The outlet quietly appended an editor's note within 2 days, and the story lost momentum fast. Karen's public image, already badly damaged within Cedar Hollow itself, took a final hit once local residents began commenting directly on the article, correcting the record in real time with their own first-hand accounts of fines, redacted minutes, and special assessments funding her family's private business venture. I received an unexpected call from a local television reporter shortly after, asking if I'd be willing to share our side on camera. Priya advised caution but ultimately agreed. A brief, carefully worded statement, focused strictly on documented facts, might help counter whatever narrative momentum Karen had tried to manufacture with her interview. I gave a short, calm interview on our own dock, deed in hand, explaining simply that our family had owned this lake for over 60 years, and that all we'd ever asked was for that ownership to be respected and left alone. The segment aired that evening, brief but unmistakably grounded in fact. Karen's response to the segment, according to Denise, was to storm out of a Cedar Hollow coffee meetup mid-conversation upon seeing it play on someone's phone. Whatever composure had defined her entire 18-month HOA presidency seemed, finally, to be dissolving entirely under the accumulated weight of consequences she could no longer outmaneuver. 2 weeks before the scheduled evidentiary hearing, Priya received formal notice that Mr. Foss had withdrawn as counsel for both Karen and Gary Whitfield, citing irreconcilable differences regarding case strategy, legal language that, translated plainly, meant even her own attorney no longer wanted his name attached to what was coming. Karen scrambled to find replacement counsel on short notice, eventually retaining a young, inexperienced lawyer clearly unfamiliar with the case's full scope. Priya, reviewing his initial filings, noted several basic procedural errors. "She's out of resources and out of allies," Priya said.
This is what it looks like when...
Meanwhile, the HOA board itself, independent of our lawsuit, moved forward with formal removal proceedings against Karen as president, properly noticed this time, scheduling a resident vote for the following month. Even her closest board allies, sensing the shifting tide, quietly withdrew their nominations to remain on the board alongside her. Gary, apparently facing separate pressure from Hollow Waters Events' other business partners, who wanted no part of the mounting legal exposure, quietly dissolved the LLC entirely, a fact Priya discovered through routine state business registry monitoring. The wedding venue scheme, whatever its original ambitions, was now formally, officially dead. None of this dissolution erased the underlying harm, though the fines, the fear, the months our children spent afraid to fish off their own family's dock, the tire slashing, the midnight trespassing, the attempted break-in. Priya reminded me gently that dissolving a business didn't equal accountability. "We still need the full reckoning," she said. In court, on record, I found myself, in these final weeks before the hearing, sleeping less rather than more, the anticipation of finally confronting everything directly almost harder to bear than the sustained months of quiet, grinding harassment that preceded it. Sarah noticed, gently suggesting I talk to someone, a therapist, about the toll this year had taken. I agreed, somewhat reluctantly, and found the sessions surprisingly helpful. A space to say plainly what I hadn't let myself fully feel amid all the documentation and legal strategy. Real fear for my children's safety. Real anger at watching neighbors turn against us based on lies. Real exhaustion from fighting something that should never have needed fighting. Emma and Danny returned home from their grandmother's the week before the hearing. The restraining order and preservation order together providing enough reassurance for Sarah and me to feel comfortable bringing them back. Emma's first request, unprompted, was to go fishing. We went that same evening, the four of us, together on the dock. Priya spent those final 2 weeks preparing meticulously, organizing 18 months of documentation into a clean, devastating chronological narrative. The original innocuous-sounding audit email, the survey stakes, the fines, the redacted minutes, the wedding listing, the LLC registration, Gary's parking lot admission, the obstruction emails, the preservation order violation, all of it woven together. Juries and judges don't respond to isolated facts nearly as powerfully as they respond to patterns, Priya explained during our final prep session. Individually, Karen could explain almost any single incident away. Together,
Light and Toen.
there's no explanation left except exactly what it looks like. A calculated, sustained scheme. The night before the evidentiary hearing. Couldn't sleep at all. Lying awake replaying the entire 18 months in fragments. The torn sign. The deputy's card number. Denise's casserole. Gary's coffee-scented threat in the parking lot. The midnight shoreline footage. Sarah found me on the porch near dawn, and we watched the sunrise together in silence. Karen arrived at the courthouse that morning without Gary beside her. Alone except for her overwhelmed young attorney. Looking nothing like the confident, laminated binder woman who'd introduced herself at that very first HOA meeting nearly 2 years earlier. Whatever armor she'd built for herself had, piece by piece, been stripped entirely away. Priya opened methodically, walking Judge Alvarez through the full timeline with exhibit after exhibit, each one building inexorably on the last. Karen's young attorney objected occasionally, procedurally, but had little substantive counterargument to offer against a record this thoroughly, damningly documented across nearly 2 years of consistent behavior. When Priya introduced the wedding venue listing, complete with the photograph unmistakably showing my grandfather's dock and Emma's fishing chair, several people in the gallery, mostly Cedar Hollow residents who'd come to watch, audibly gasped. Karen stared fixedly at the table in front of her, refusing to look up. Denise took the stand next, calm and clear despite her obvious nerves, recounting everything she'd witnessed, the pattern from Karen's previous neighborhood, the survey stakes, the tire slashing timeline, the overheard one card left to play comment. Karen's young attorney's cross-examination was brief, clearly unable to shake anything Denise had said. I testified last, walking the court through my own experience simply and factually. The torn sign, the fines paid under protest, Emma's fear at the bus stop, the scratched back door handle at 2 a.m. Careful, as Priya had coached me, to let the documented facts speak louder than any emotion, though emotion crept in regardless. Under cross-examination, Karen's attorney attempted to suggest I'd exaggerated the harassment pattern for litigation advantage. I simply pointed to the Sheriff's Department incident reports, time-stamped and independently filed, months before any lawsuit escalation strategy could have been planned around them. The attorney had no real follow-up question ready. Judge Alvarez called a brief recess before Karen's own testimony, and I watched her in the hallway, alone on a bench, staring at nothing in particular, looking less like the calculating woman who'd once told me, "The board has determined shared jurisdiction," and more like someone finally facing, fully, the scale of what she'd built. When Karen finally took the stand, her testimony wavered noticeably, contradicting earlier deposition statements about when exactly the wedding venue plans began relative to the Lake Initiative newsletters. Priya's cross-examination was patient but relentless, walking Karen, sentence by sentence, into her own documented timeline until the contradictions became impossible to explain away. "Did you sign a lease agreement for this land 3 weeks before publicly proposing any lake improvement project to Cedar Hollow residents?" Priya asked directly. Karen hesitated a long moment, glancing toward her attorney, who offered no help. "Yes," she finally said, barely audible. The courtroom, for a moment, went completely still. That single admission, dragged out under oath after 18 months of denial, deflection, and carefully worded newsletters, effectively ended any remaining ambiguity about Karen's true motives. Judge Alvarez recessed for the day, announcing she would issue a comprehensive ruling within the week. But the outcome, by then, felt like a foregone conclusion to everyone in that room. The week of waiting before the ruling felt longer than the entire 18 months combined. I found myself checking the court's online docket obsessively, refreshing a page that showed nothing new hour after hour, unable to fully exhale until something official, permanent, undeniable existed in writing beyond Karen's single cracked admission. Sarah suggested we use the waiting week productively rather than anxiously, and together we began quietly repairing what the fight had damaged beyond the legal question itself. Reaching out to Chris's family for a genuine conversation, thanking Denise properly with dinner rather than just gratitude, letting the kids simply be kids again, uninterrupted. Chris and his wife came over for that dinner. Awkward at first, both families navigating months of accumulated distance and misplaced blame. "I should have asked you directly instead of believing what I read," Chris admitted over dessert. I know how convincing she could sound. I told him honestly that I understood. Karen had been convincing to almost everyone. For a long time, Denise, over her own dinner invitation a few nights later, finally told us the fuller story of what had happened in her friend's old neighborhood, the one Karen had targeted before. Cedar Hollow, a pool committee takeover, a family who'd resisted, a missing dog, a lawsuit that had ultimately settled quietly, unpublicized, before real accountability ever landed. That family gave up, Denise said quietly. Moved away rather than keep fighting. I always wondered if anyone would ever actually hold her accountable, or if she'd just keep doing this, neighborhood after neighborhood, until nobody had the resources left to stop her. I thought about how close we'd come, more than once, to being that family too. Priya called midweek with an update. Not the ruling itself yet, but news that the county district attorney's office had reached out independently, having reviewed the obstruction, evidence and preservation order violation through the court's public filings, exploring whether criminal charges might be warranted alongside our civil case's resolution. This could mean actual consequences beyond money, Priya explained. Fraud, obstruction, potentially witness tampering given the restraining order violations we're still investigating around that break-in attempt. Civil cases end with a check. Criminal cases end with something that actually follows her, on record, wherever she goes next. I felt something in my chest finally begin to loosen. The HOA board's own removal vote against Karen took place that same week. Entirely separate from our lawsuit's timeline but clearly influenced by everything that had surfaced publicly. Cedar Hollow residents, packing the clubhouse once more, voted overwhelmingly to remove her from the presidency. Effective immediately, along with formal censure for the board's conduct. Karen didn't attend the removal vote in person, sending instead a brief written statement read aloud by the interim board chair, offering a carefully lawyered non-apology about regrettable misunderstandings that satisfied absolutely no one in the room. Even her most loyal former allies had, by then, quietly moved on from defending her at all. I wasn't present for that vote either, having promised Sarah and the kids a quiet weekend away from anything Cedar Hollow related. Our first real family trip in over a year. We rented a small cabin 2 hours away. No security cameras. No legal folders. Just 4 days of hiking, board games, and uninterrupted sleep. Emma asked, on a hiking trail far from any lake dispute, whether we'd still live in Cedar Hollow when this was all over. I told her yes, that our home, our lake, our dock weren't going anywhere, that we'd fought this hard specifically so she could keep fishing there for the rest of her childhood. Undisturbed. Danny, characteristically more direct, simply asked, "Is the lake lady going to jail?" I told him honestly that I didn't know yet, that it wasn't really up to me, but that grown-ups who broke rules and hurt people usually did eventually face real consequences, even when it took much longer than felt fair. We returned from the cabin refreshed in a way I hadn't expected possible, given everything still unresolved. Priya called that Monday morning, her voice carrying a different energy than any previous call. "Judge Alvarez's ruling just posted," she said.
You should sit down.
I sat, Sarah beside me, phone on speaker, kids momentarily distracted by cartoons in the next room. Priya read through the ruling's opening findings. Unambiguous confirmation of our sole private ownership of the lake and surrounding shoreline, predating Cedar Hollow's HOA formation by over a decade. No legitimate association claim whatsoever. The ruling continued, methodically dismantling every fine, every notice, every shared jurisdiction claim Karen had constructed over 18 months, voiding them entirely and ordering full reimbursement with interest. But the truly significant portion came next, addressing the fraud and conspiracy allegations tied to the wedding venue scheme directly. Judge Alvarez found, based on the evidence presented, that Karen and Gary Whitfield had knowingly and deliberately misrepresented the ownership status of private property for personal financial gain, constructing a false narrative of community benefit specifically to conceal a commercial venture built entirely on land they had no legal claim to. The court awarded significant compensatory damages covering our legal fees, the fines paid under protest, and additional damages for the documented harassment pattern, though Priya cautioned the true number would depend on the Whitfields' actual ability to pay, given Gary's dissolved LLC and apparently limited remaining assets. More important to me than any dollar figure was the ruling's final paragraph. Formally, permanently establishing on public record that the lake had never belonged to Cedar Hollow's HOA, that my family's ownership stretched back 60 years, and that any future resident, any future board, would find this exact question settled beyond dispute. I hung up the phone and simply sat for a long moment, Sarah's hand tight in mine, the weight of 18 months finally, genuinely lifting rather than just temporarily lightening. Emma wandered in, curious about our silence. "Did we win?" she asked. "Yeah, baby," I said, my voice cracking slightly. Word spread through Cedar Hollow within hours, the ruling becoming public record almost immediately. Neighbors who doubted us, neighbors who'd believed Karen's version, neighbors who'd simply stayed quiet out of fear, all reached out in the following days, some with genuine apologies, others simply relieved the long, exhausting saga had finally reached resolution. Karen's replacement events website, Hollow Waters Events, had already gone offline by the time the ruling posted. Though Priya confirmed the DA's office had opened a formal criminal investigation into the obstruction and fraud allegations, separate from our now concluded civil matter, with Karen and Gary both named as subjects. I drove past Karen's house a few days later, not out of any desire to gloat, simply on my normal route home from work, and noticed a moving truck in her driveway, boxes stacked along the walkway. Whatever remained of her life in Cedar Hollow seemed, she'd decided, couldn't survive the community's collective memory of what she'd done. Denise texted me a photo of the moving truck with a single line, "Good riddance," though I almost feel bad for whatever neighborhood gets her next. I felt something similar, a complicated mixture of relief and unease, knowing Karen's pattern, according to Denise's earlier story, had repeated itself before, and might again somewhere new. Priya, when I mentioned that worry, offered some reassurance. The criminal investigation and this civil ruling both become part of her public record now, she said. Any HOA doing basic due diligence on a new board candidate would find this. It won't stop her from trying elsewhere, but it makes it considerably harder. The Cedar Hollow HOA, under its new interim leadership, formally issued a community-wide apology for the special assessments used, unknowingly by most residents, to fund Karen's personal legal defense, and announced a full independent audit of all board decisions made during her 18-month tenure, a process Priya agreed to assist voluntarily. That audit, completed over the following 2 months, revealed the full scope of what Karen had orchestrated. Not just the lake scheme, but smaller, similar patterns, inflated landscaping contracts routed through a cousin's company, a community fund that had quietly covered several of her own family's HOA dues over the years. Reading the audit's final report, I felt less shock than a kind of grim confirmation. Karen hadn't simply overreached once, dramatically, over our lake. She'd built an entire quiet ecosystem of small thefts and manipulations across her tenure, and our refusal to back down had, apparently, been the first real crack in a much larger pattern. The county district attorney's investigation moved forward steadily over the following weeks, aided significantly by the evidentiary record our own case had already established. Gary Whitfield, facing mounting pressure and clearly less equipped than Karen for sustained legal combat, agreed to cooperate, providing detailed testimony about the wedding venue scheme's true origins. His cooperation implicated Karen directly and specifically in orchestrating both the initial deception and the later obstruction, including personally instructing the management company staff to redact deed-related information and personally directing the box loading. Court order violating attempt to relocate incriminating financial records before the evidentiary hearing. Karen, facing her husband's cooperation and an increasingly airtight case, ultimately accepted a plea agreement rather than risk trial, pleading guilty to fraud and obstruction of justice charges, receiving a sentence that included probation, substantial restitution, and a formal prohibition against serving on any homeowners association board for a period of 10 years. I attended the sentencing hearing, not out of any desire for spectacle, but because Priya believed, and I agreed, that it mattered for the record, for closure, for every family who might face someone like Karen in the future, to see the full weight of consequences finally, publicly, unmistakably land. Karen didn't look at me during the hearing, her eyes fixed somewhere near the judge's bench throughout, her voice small and unrecognizable from the confident woman who'd once told me, at my own gate, "I have rights," as if that phrase alone could rewrite 60 years of recorded county history in her favor. Outside the courthouse afterward, a small cluster of reporters, drawn by the local news segment from months earlier, asked if I had any statement. I kept it brief, the same instinct Priya had coached into me from the beginning. "We just wanted our family's land respected," I said. The law agreed to be about. That evening, driving home, I took the long way past the lake, watching the late sun catch the water exactly the way it had when my grandfather first showed me this place as a boy, decades before Karen Whitfield ever moved to Cedar Hollow, decades before any of this became necessary to fight for at all. Sarah met me at the dock with the kids already there, fishing poles out, Danny arguing cheerfully with Emma about whose bait smelled worse. I sat down beside them without saying anything about court, about sentencing, about 18 months of documents now sitting quietly in a folder we'd probably never need to open again. "Everything okay?" Sarah asked quietly, reading something in my face. "Yeah," I said, watching Emma's bobber dip beneath the surface, her delighted shriek carrying across water that had always, truly, only ever belonged to us. "Everything's finally okay." In the weeks that followed, Cedar Hollow settled into an unfamiliar, welcome normalcy. The new HOA board, chastened by the audit's findings, adopted stricter transparency rules, published all financial records openly, and formally amended its bylaws to explicitly exclude any privately deeded property from future association claims, closing the loophole Karen had exploited. Denise organized a small gathering at the clubhouse, half thank you, half informal celebration, where neighbors who'd once avoided eye contact at the mailbox now approached openly, some with genuine warmth, others with lingering awkwardness they clearly wanted to move past. I accepted every gesture the same way, without grudge, without gloating. Chris's family became regular dock guests again, his kids and mine picking up their friendship almost exactly where it had paused, the way children often do, without needing lengthy explanations for the adult's complicated year. Watching them laugh together on a warm evening felt like its own quiet form of restitution. Priya, wrapping up the final administrative details of our case, mentioned that 2 other Cedar Hollow families had separately reached out to her, having recognized troubling patterns in their own HOA's newer leadership, hoping to understand their rights before anything escalated the way ours had. Some good, seemed, had rippled outward regardless. I thought often, in those quieter weeks, about what might have happened if I'd simply paid that first $250 fine without protest, if I'd let the small compliance requests accumulate unchallenged, the way Karen had clearly counted on most residents doing. Persistence, not confrontation for its own sake, had been the thing that mattered most. Sarah and I eventually replaced the worn, weathered dock boards, not out of necessity exactly, but as a small, deliberate act of reclamation. Each new board a quiet statement that this place remained ours, unshaken, exactly as it had been through 3 generations before Karen Whitfield ever arrived to test that fact. Emma, helping hammer in the final board that Saturday, asked if we could put up a small sign of our own, something to replace the "No Trespassing" HOA Lake Access placard from all those months earlier. Together, we settled on something simpler: Reyes Family Lake, Est. 1962, carved neatly into cedar. Danny wanted to add "Karen Not Welcome" underneath, which made all of us laugh harder than the moment probably deserved. A release of tension built up over 18 exhausting months, finally finding somewhere harmless to land. We settled, instead, on simply the family name and the year, understated and permanent. The restitution payments began arriving slowly over the following months. Modest amounts given the Whitfields' limited remaining assets after Gary's business dissolution and mounting legal fees of his own. But Priya reminded me the money had never really been the point. The public record, the accountability, the truth finally, formally acknowledged. That was the actual victory. I heard, secondhand through Denise's ever-reliable network, that Karen and Gary had relocated out of state entirely, starting over somewhere neither of them had any HOA leadership history yet. Whether her pattern would eventually repeat itself elsewhere, I genuinely didn't know, and had, by then, made a conscious choice to stop carrying that worry. Priya's parting advice, delivered over a final celebratory lunch once every filing had closed, stuck with me long after the case ended. Document everything. Always, she said. Not because you expect to need it, but because the moment you need it, it's already too late to start. You did that instinctively. It saved you. I thanked her, genuinely, for guiding us through something I never could have navigated alone, and for believing, from that very first conversation, that a stubborn deed and a stack of printed emails could eventually outlast someone determined to bend an entire community's trust toward her own private gain. Life in Cedar Hollow, in the months that followed, returned to something recognizably like the quiet, unremarkable place we'd first moved into 3 years earlier. HOA meetings became boring again, in the best possible way, focused on mailbox colors and mowing schedules rather than manufactured emergencies over land that was never in question. Emma's fear of the lake lady faded gradually into a distant memory, replaced by ordinary childhood milestones. A first fish caught entirely without help. A summer spent teaching Danny to swim off the very dock that had once worn a laminated trespassing sign zip-tied cruelly to its post. On the 1-year anniversary of that first torn sign, Sarah and I sat on the dock after the kids had gone to bed, a bottle of wine between us, watching the water go still and silver under a rising moon. "Can you believe how close we came to just walking away from all this?" she asked quietly. I thought about that possibility often, in the year since, how easily exhaustion, fear, or simple financial calculation might have convinced a different family to fold, to accept Karen's quiet settlement offer, to let 60 years of ownership dissolve into a vague, unresolved shared jurisdiction, rather than fight for the truth on record. "We almost did," I admitted. "That coffee shop meeting, when she offered to waive the fines if we just signed something quiet. Part of me wanted to just be done with it." Sarah nodded slowly. "I know," she said. "But we'd have spent every year after wondering if we'd let her win anyway. We never did find out for certain who had cut our irrigation line, slashed our tires, or scratched our back door handle that terrifying 2 a.m. Priya believed, based on circumstantial evidence, it had almost certainly been Gary, desperate and increasingly reckless as the scheme unraveled, though it was never formally charged as a separate crime. Some mysteries, I came to accept, simply wouldn't resolve as neatly as the deed dispute itself had. What mattered, in the end, wasn't punishing every individual act of harassment to the fullest possible degree, but establishing, permanently and publicly, that the underlying scheme itself had been exposed, dismantled, and formally condemned. The county even updated its public land record system, at Priya's suggestion, to include a note referencing the ruling directly alongside our deed. A small bureaucratic addition that nonetheless meant any future dispute, any future Karen, would find the question answered before they'd even finished drafting their first misleading newsletter. I sometimes wondered what might have happened if Denise hadn't shared that first warning at the meeting so long ago. If I hadn't started keeping that folder of emails from the very beginning. If 100 small choices along the way had gone even slightly differently. The margin for a different outcome, I realized, had been thinner than it felt. Priya later told me our case had become something of a quiet reference point among local HOA attorneys, cited informally in conversations about board overreach and the limits of association authority over privately deeded land predating a community's formation. Small comfort, perhaps, but a genuine one, knowing our fight might help someone else's go faster. Cedar Hollow's new HOA president, a soft-spoken retired teacher named Mrs. Alvarado, unrelated to the judge despite the shared surname, reached out personally to thank our family for what she called an accidental gift to every future resident here. The newly amended bylaws now protecting private property rights explicitly, permanently, in writing. I told her, honestly, that I'd never wanted to be anyone's cautionary tale or lesson learned, that we'd simply wanted to be left alone with our lake, our dock, our kids' fishing chairs. But if something useful had come out of 18 exhausting months regardless, I suppose that counted for something too. The following spring, we hosted our own small gathering at the lake. An open invitation posted in the neighborhood app. Nothing official. Nothing HOA sanctioned. Just a family cookout with the dock and shoreline open to any Cedar Hollow neighbor who wanted to come fish, swim, or simply sit by water that had, finally, stopped being a battlefield. Dozens of families showed up throughout the afternoon. Kids splashing in the shallows. Adults trading easy conversation over grilled burgers. the entire community, gradually reclaiming a place that Karen's scheme had, for a year and a half, transformed into something tense and contested rather than simply, quietly beautiful. Denise arrived early and stayed late, helping Sarah manage the food table, occasionally catching my eye across the yard with a small, satisfied smile that needed no words to explain. She'd been the first to warn me, all those months ago, and the last one standing beside us when it finally, fully ended. Chris brought his kids. Of course, Danny and Emma, immediately dragging them toward the water with the easy, forgiving joy that children seem to manage far more gracefully than adults ever quite do. Watching them together, I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled since that very first torn sign. As the sun began setting that evening, casting long gold light across the water exactly the way it had in my earliest childhood memories of this place, I found myself standing quietly at the shoreline, Sarah beside me, watching our kids and their friends laugh somewhere out near the old willow tree. "Your grandfather would be proud," Sarah said softly, echoing something Denise had told me weeks earlier at the sentencing hearing's edge. I thought about the man who'd bought this land decades before any of us imagined a woman named Karen would ever try to claim it wasn't rightfully ours to begin with. I thought, too, about every small decision that had mattered along the way, keeping that first email instead of deleting it in frustration, calling the sheriff instead of confronting, Karen physically at the inflatable slide, trusting Priya's patient strategy instead of Karen's tempting, quiet settlement offers designed to make the fight simply disappear. None of it had felt heroic in the moment. Mostly it had felt exhausting, frightening, and unfair. An entire year and a half stolen from what should have been simple, ordinary family life. But standing there that evening, watching Emma and Danny cast their lines into water that would always, now unmistakably, remain theirs, felt worth every difficult day. Priya sent one final email a few weeks later, closing out the last administrative loose ends of the case. "For what it's worth," she wrote, "in 15 years of HOA litigation, I don't think I've seen a family document a case this thoroughly, or fight this patiently. That's why you won. Preparation." I printed that email and added it to the folder, now thick with 18 months of accumulated proof, and placed it in a drawer in my home office rather than a filing cabinet, close enough to remember, far enough to no longer need daily. Some fights, I understood now, you carry the lesson of long after the paperwork closes. That fall, Cedar Hollow's HOA newsletter, under Mrs. Alvarado's steadier leadership, ran a small feature about the amended bylaws protecting private property rights, mentioning our case only briefly, respectfully, without sensationalizing what our family had actually lived through. Felt, finally, like the right way for this story to exist in community memory. Emma, now a year older, occasionally still asked questions about the lake lady, less from fear now than genuine childhood curiosity about a strange chapter in her family's history. I answered honestly, age-appropriately, that sometimes people try to take things that aren't theirs, and sometimes the only way to stop them is to simply refuse to give up. Danny's version of the lesson was simpler, delivered with the blunt clarity only a child can manage. "She lied and got caught," he said one evening, matter of fact, watching his bobber drift lazily across still water. "That's basically it, right?" I laughed, Genuinely, for the first time in a long while thinking about the whole saga. Basically, yeah, I said. Sarah and I talked, occasionally, about whether we'd handle things differently if we somehow faced something similar again. Though we both agreed, honestly, we wouldn't change much. The instinct to document everything, to seek proper legal counsel early, to remain patient rather than reactive, had ultimately been exactly what carried us through. Denise, well into her 70s now, still checked in regularly, sometimes just to chat, sometimes to share whatever small piece of Cedar Hollow gossip had crossed her radar that week. Though nothing ever again carried the weight or danger of what Karen Whitfield had brought into the neighborhood during her brief, damaging tenure. I ran into Gary once, unexpectedly, at a hardware store 2 counties over, months after their relocation out of state. He looked older, worn down in a way that had nothing to do with age, and simply nodded once, wordlessly, before walking quickly toward a different aisle. I let him go without comment. That small, silent encounter felt, oddly, like a fitting final note to the entire saga. No dramatic confrontation. No last angry words exchanged. Just 2 men who'd once stood on opposite sides of something that never should have needed fighting at all, quietly acknowledging, without speaking, that it was finally, truly over. I never did learn whether Karen ever attempted anything similar in whatever new community she and Gary settled into afterward. Priya's warning about the public record following her stayed with me. A small, imperfect comfort that at least made repeating the same exact scheme considerably harder, even if it couldn't guarantee she'd never try some smaller version of it again. What I did know, with total certainty, standing on our dock each evening watching my children fish in water that had always, rightfully, belonged to our family, was that persistence, documentation, and a refusal to be quietly bullied out of what was legitimately ours had made all the difference between losing everything and keeping it intact. The lake itself, unbothered by any of the human drama that had swirled around its edges for 18 exhausting months, simply continued doing what it had always done, catching the morning light, holding bluegill and bass for eager young anglers, reflecting a sky that changed with the seasons but never once cared who claimed to own it on paper. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I thought about that very first sentence in Karen's very first amenities audit email, so innocuous sounding at the time, and marveled at how an entire year and a half of fear, fines, sabotage, and eventual criminal prosecution had unfolded from something that had initially seemed almost too minor to worry about. That, I eventually understood, was precisely the lesson worth carrying forward. Overreach rarely announces itself plainly at the start. It arrives dressed as reasonable process, as community concern, as routine paperwork, and only reveals its true shape once enough small compliances have accumulated to make resistance feel, falsely, like the unreasonable choice. I made a point, in the years that followed, of staying more engaged with Cedar Hollow's HOA meetings than I ever had before Karen's tenure, not out of lingering suspicion exactly, but out of a hard-earned understanding that quiet, disengaged communities are precisely the conditions someone like her needs most to operate freely within. Mrs. Grateful for the increased resident engagement our ordeal had inadvertently inspired, eventually asked if I'd consider joining the board myself, in a minor capacity, helping review governing documents for exactly the kind of ambiguity Karen had once so skillfully exploited. I agreed, cautiously, understanding the irony completely. Serving on that board, reviewing bylaws line by line alongside neighbors who'd once doubted our family's version of events, felt like its own quiet form of closure, transforming 18 months of exhausting personal defense into something that might, eventually, protect some future family from ever needing to fight the exact same battle we had. Emma, now old enough to understand more of the details, asked once whether I ever regretted fighting so hard, given everything it had cost, the stress, the fear, the strained friendships, the sleepless nights. I told her, without hesitation, that the only thing I regretted was that we'd ever needed to fight at all. But no, I continued, I don't regret standing up for what was actually ours. If we'd just given in, this lake, your lake, wouldn't be yours anymore.
Someone would be renting it out for strangers' weddings right now instead of you catching.
She considered that for a long moment, staring out at the water, then nodded slowly, the way children do when an abstract lesson finally lands somewhere concrete and real. I'm glad you didn't give up, she said simply, before running off to help Danny untangle a fishing line snagged in the willow's low branches. Watching her go, I thought about Priya's final email again, about preparation mattering more than luck, about Denise's early warning that could have easily gone unheeded, about every torn sign and redacted document and quiet coffee shop meeting that had, collectively, determined whether this lake stayed ours or slipped away under a stranger's careful manipulation. Cedar Hollow, 3 years after Karen Whitfield's departure, remained a genuinely good place to live, quieter now in every sense that mattered. Its HOA newsletters back to discussing mailbox colors and mowing schedules, its residents trusting one another again in the easy, unremarkable way small communities are supposed to function. The special Lake Initiative line item never appeared in another budget again. The amended bylaws, protecting private property explicitly, remained untouched and unchallenged. And our family's dock, weathered by seasons but sturdy as ever, continued holding fishing lines, laughter, and quiet summer evenings exactly the way it always had before any of this began. I kept the small Reyes family Lake Est 1962-inch sign nailed firmly to the dock post, weathered now by years of sun and rain, permanent, understated reminder of everything our family had refused to lose, and everything, ultimately, we'd managed to protect through nothing more dramatic than patience, documentation, and refusing to back down. Looking back now, I understand the entire ordeal not as a story about a lake. Not really, but about the quiet, cumulative danger of unchecked authority, however small its official scope might seem, and the equally quiet, cumulative power of simply refusing to let a lie become accepted truth through exhaustion alone. The aftermath left more than just legal closure behind. Cedar Hollow's residents, chastened by how easily a false narrative had once taken hold, became noticeably more careful readers of HOA communications, more willing to ask direct questions, more skeptical of vague language dressed up as community consensus. Something durable had genuinely changed here. Karen's name, eventually, faded from everyday conversation, mentioned only occasionally, usually as shorthand for a certain kind of overreach neighbors now recognized and resisted quickly whenever it threatened to resurface in some smaller, unrelated form. "Don't let this become another Karen situation," someone joked at a meeting once, and everyone understood immediately. Our family, meanwhile, simply returned to living the ordinary life we'd always wanted here. Fishing, swimming, quiet evenings on the water, a home built on land my grandfather had chosen decades before Cedar Hollow existed at all. Land that remained, now permanently and publicly confirmed, entirely, unquestionably ours. I think of that torn sign sometimes. Still, the one zip-tied cruelly to our dock post that first Saturday morning. Emma standing beside me confused, fishing pole in hand. It marked, I've come to believe, not the beginning of our misfortune, but the beginning of the fight that ultimately protected everything that mattered most. Some evenings, watching Emma and Danny cast their lines into water-lit gold by the setting sun, I think about how easily this could have gone differently, how many families, faced with the same escalating fines and quiet intimidation, simply give up before ever discovering the truth was fully, provably on their side. We didn't give up, and the law, eventually, answered for us exactly the way it should have from the very beginning, cutting through 18 months of manufactured confusion with a single, undeniable, permanently recorded fact. This lake was ours, had always been ours, and no laminated binder or rehearsed smile could ever change that. Standing on that dock today, watching my children laugh in the golden evening light, I know with complete certainty that some things really are worth fighting for, patiently, persistently, and without ever backing down. No matter how tired the fight makes you, no matter how long the law takes to finally, fully answer, our lake remains exactly what it always was. Quiet, private, and entirely, rightfully ours.